All right, welcome everyone. We're going to get started here. This is Upzone New Hampshire, Ideas and Legislation. My name is Jason Sorens. I'll be moderating this panel. And first off, I want to acknowledge the sponsor of this panel, which is the Center for Ethics and Society at St. Anselm College, the home of the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas. So relevant to the topic of this panel, and you can find them online at www.anselm.edu/ethics. All right, I want to introduce our panel very quickly here. We've got some distinguished guests to talk about zoning here. On the far left, as you face them, we have Representative Josh Yokella, who has been representing the towns of Fremont, Brentwood, and Danville at the New Hampshire State House since 2018. He served on the Town of Fremont Zoning Board since 2017. He's currently on the Municipal and County Government Committee and the Special Committee on Housing. All right, to his left, we have Charlie Gardner. He is a research fellow at the Mercatus Center, whose research focuses on planning law and housing affordability. During a career as an attorney devoted primarily to the practice of civil litigation, he nurtured an interest in cities and urban planning, which he developed into an area of expertise through his work at the Old Urbanist blog and his involvement in state and local policy and planning. He works especially on zoning and land use issues as a local elected official and as an active participant in state policymaking, where he serves on the Connecticut State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future. And then last but not least, certainly, we have Andrew Klein, who is the president of the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy. Before that, he was an independent writer and communications consultant. And many of you know him from his career as editorial page editor of the New Hampshire Union Leader. And he's been published in more than 100 newspapers and magazines, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic Monthly, Boston Globe, Weekly Standard, and National Review. He's also chair of the State Board of Education, and he's on the boards of the Daniel Webster Council and the Educational Farm at Joppa Hill, a nonprofit teaching farm in Bedford. All right, so let's get started. I thought the way we would frame this is first, let's talk about the issue and the importance of the issue, and some of this will be a little bit of old hat maybe to some of you in this room. For others, it may be relatively new. But let's first talk about when we use this term upzone, where we're talking about zoning. Okay, so what is zoning? What does it do and what doesn't it do? And I'll throw that to you first, Drew.
Oh goodness, zoning. That's a big one. So, if I can, since we're in Nashua, if you will indulge me, I'm gonna read a little bit. This will give you an idea. This is from the Nashua Master Plan. This is what zoning does. So most people think zoning and planning is just we're just gonna
Make sure you get right in that mic.
It's actually switched off.
Oh, is it? Okay.
There we go. That would be better if it's on. Okay. So most people think zoning is just simply, okay, you can't put an industrial factory next to your single-family house, right? Or you can't put a 20-story apartment building in a single-family neighborhood. That's zoning. But the master plans and the codes for your municipality, whether it's a city or a town, are incredibly complex and very, very long. They do things like say how close your house can be to your road. So a lot of towns have a 200-foot setback from the road. So if you can envision, and I guess, first of all, before I won't take too much time on this, but I just want everybody to close your eyes and picture in your head, just picture in your head a New England village or New England town. Just with whatever pops in your head, New England town. Now I'm going to guess that most of you pictured something that looks like downtown Portsmouth or the Oval in Amherst. One of these
Milford.
Really cute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Milford's got the Oval. I wish.
Milford's got the Oval. What do you call the
Amherst Village?
The village in Amherst is perfect. So most of you picture those, I would imagine. That's what we kind of think of when we think of New England. And I'm here to tell you, unfortunately, because of zoning, those are now illegal. and I'm not exaggerating. The Portsmouth, where you see all these beautiful colonial homes, that is illegal to build those homes in that way, that close to a street, in most of the rest of Portsmouth outside the historic district. You probably couldn't build that now in the historic district. Amherst, most of what you think of around the village there is illegal in the rest of Amherst. You can't build houses that close to the road. You can't build houses that close together. This is from Nashua's building code. I'm quoting. No land or building shall hereafter be used or occupied, and no building or part thereof shall hereafter be constructed, erected, altered, or moved, unless in conformity with all of the regulations herein specified for the zoning district in which it will be located, and it goes on. And that includes stuff like how many people you can have living in a bedroom, how big each bedroom has to be. So we think of zoning as just, the land, but it gets into the details of how wide your staircase has to be, how many stairs you have to have on your staircase, how far apart they can be from each other. I know because we had to have a staircase torn up after it was put in because it was slightly off the regulation. That's how detailed zoning can get. So that's just conceptually what I want you to think of when we talk about it.
Yeah. All right. So when we think about the effects of zoning, what is the relationship between zoning and the housing market? And I'll start with you at the end, Representative.
So for the housing market, I would say that zoning is a hindrance as far as what are you planning, like it's restrictions on your property, right? You have a plot of land, you want to build something, you want to build 5 somethings. Your ideas are going to be limited by the government, by zoning, by how, like he said, how many acres you need to have per lot, how close to the water that you can be. The property that I live on is currently essentially unbuildable because I'm too close to the water. My entire property is too close to the water. So my back deck sometimes is in the water. And so all of those types of things, as far as, how much septic, how deep your septic is, all of those types of things create barriers and increase costs. And then there's also the state that comes in and says, actually, we want to encourage non-development, specifically current use. 52% of the land in New Hampshire is in current use. And current use is essentially when you say, okay, I'm not going to develop this. I'm not going to put any housing on it. And we're going to get a massive tax break, like 90%. Like per acre, some people are spending less than $1 for taxes, whereas other people, obviously, if you're building a house, you might have to spend thousands of dollars in taxes for that same plot of land if it was developed. So the state is incentivizing you to not develop, and then when you try and develop, they put all these barriers in your way.
So it sounds like your house is sort of in the same situation as Amherst Village, where if God forbid, knock on wood and all that, it burned down and you didn't rebuild it right away, you would not be allowed to rebuild it.
Yes. Luckily in my town, we have like 2 years to start the reconstruction or whatever. But yes, it would have to be on the exact same footprint. Otherwise I would have to do variances, lots of variances, for water, for setbacks, for everything. I would have, a half a dozen, if not more, variances that I would need from the current zoning.
So it's an obstacle to building. It's an obstacle to supply. Charlie, do you have thoughts on that, on the effects of zoning on the housing market?
Yeah, I think it can be difficult to tell the direct.
Got to get right into the mic,
unfortunately. Get right into the mic, sure. No, it's all right. It's actually a big part of the work that we do at Mercatus is focusing on how zoning interacts with housing production. And sometimes it can be difficult to see the direct connection. There may be a lot of zoning capacity on paper. At time I said, well, there are plenty of buildable sites. We still have a lot of zone capacity, but in economic terms, it's not feasible to develop a lot of those sites, or a lot of them, it's simply not economical given people's incomes. So you're seeing very low housing production. And the zoning in some cases dates back decades or as much as 100 years, and is way out of step with current demands. So what the changes are may not immediately be obvious, but they're showing up in these very low rates of housing production, even in in-demand markets. And you can see that state by state, and in comparing certain cities, like the rate of housing production in New York City, for example, which was heavily downzoned back in the 1960s, and really has never been upzoned since then, compared to a market like Houston, where there is no zoning, where they're building an enormous number of units per year, and it's second in the country in population growth for a metro area. So you can sort of infer these things, but in the details, you have to look a little bit closer. Definitely in New England, it's a major impediment to housing production.
Now I'm going to come right back at you because one of the things we think about in legal terms, and you're an attorney, and so I want you to speak to this. Zoning, when you downzone, as you mentioned, New York City did, and my town has attempted it over and over, and sometimes it's gotten through and sometimes not. Some of us there are fighting it. You're taking away property rights from people. Right? There are plots of land that used to be developable; they're no longer developable. That's going to decrease the value of the land, right? Empty land that you can't do anything with isn't worth a lot of money. Is this a regulatory taking? How is this constitutional?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I should give this to. We have a gentleman who actually wrote the book on regulatory taking, sitting in the third row, Professor Fischel, who some of you may have attended his talk with Professor Kaplan a little earlier before. So I'm a little intimidated trying to take this question on in front of him. But it is a good question. I think the way that this has been litigated many times at the Supreme Court, going back to as far back as 1915 or before, and the general interpretation, this is constitutional law, right? Private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. That's the starting point for the whole discussion. And the question was, well, clearly expropriating somebody's property, completely taking title to it, that's a taking. They're owed compensation. But what about if I use regulation, a law that limits what you can do with your property? What if I take away your right to operate a business, or right to operate a brick-making facility or something else that dramatically decreases the value of your property? That was the case, one of the first cases back in 1915 in Los Angeles, where a property was devalued by over 90% by the city council, basically outlawed a brickworks that had been there, was already operating. People started to move around the brickworks. There was some controversy as to whether the person on the Los Angeles City Council who advanced the measure had real estate interests in the area. The court didn't really get to that. You can see the potential for a little bit of corruption here. But ultimately, the Supreme Court said no, because takings are essentially limited to direct taking of title to the property, not to use. And that's been addressed again and again since that time. You may have heard of the Euclid case, the Pennsylvania coal case, all the way up to the Penn Central case in 1978. There have been new tests that have been developed, but they haven't quite gotten to the point of saying that the takings clause encompasses restricting what you can do with your property. There are other tests available that are not quite the same, but unfortunately, unless you take 100% of the value of the property by regulation, generally the position is you're not entitled to compensation, whether it's 10%, 50%, 90%. People disagree with that. They say, well, that makes no sense at all. It's like if I rob you and I take $19 out of your wallet and I leave you with $1, that's okay, right? I haven't stolen anything from you. But if I take that last dollar, all of a sudden I've got to compensate you. That's theft, which seems arbitrary. But at least right. But nonetheless, the rule has been dividing. Said, well, you can tell me whatever I'm doing with my property. That's a different matter. That's the police power. That's just regulation. It can get a lot more complex beyond that. But that's the way the takings clause has been interpreted, and there's been a lot more legal analysis than that. The current standard of things. I won't belabor this point at any greater length, but Stephen Eagle, he's a GMU law professor who wrote on this. Says at least the current state of the law. This is the Penn Central test. He said is under-theorized, subjective, with its factors mutually referential, and unable to provide a reliable guide to courts or litigants. It's not exactly a ringing endorsement, I think, from a law professor on the state of things. But nonetheless, that's where they are right now. So.
Yeah. I mean, this brings to mind, maybe this is a rhetorical question, but I mean, governments, instead of downzoning, let's say a town wants to limit density. I mean, one way they could do this is simply by buying development rights, but no one ever does that, right?
Why spend money when you can just write some words on a piece of paper and everybody has to do what you say?
Right.
Now, I would just add there, and this is something that Arizona has done, the other option that's available, of course, you have state constitutions, and it's possible to propose an amendment that says any municipality that downzones a property owes the property owner compensation relative to the value of that downzoning. Yeah, which is something that can be done through the constitutional amendment process or potentially even through state legislation. So it's not just the federal constitution that's there, that's this monolith, and I believe it's Arizona that's actually done that, which would potentially stop most downzonings.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you're right about Arizona, and I believe I've even read some news articles where town officials are quoted as saying, well, we could people want us to do this, but it's just not worth the cost, and so that's pretty telling. All right, so let's think about zoning in New Hampshire. Charlie, you mentioned that in New England, zoning is a major barrier to housing production. How does zoning in New Hampshire compare to the rest of the country? And really, this is for the whole panel.
Yeah, I guess I just start by going back with a little bit of zoning history, because zoning in the states, even though it varies from city to city, the overall framework is pretty similar. It was back in the 1920s. It was the federal government put together what was called the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. This is Herbert Hoover's Chamber of Commerce, and marketed this to all of the states as a sort of a template for delegating the zoning power to municipalities within each state. And more or less, there are a few exceptions, but most states adopted something pretty similar to the Enabling Act, and it's still on the books today. You can go look up New Hampshire's or a similar state, and you'll see very often very similar kind of dated language from the 1920s about preventing undue concentration of population and things like this, just generally anti-urban sentiments related to industrial era concerns that aren't really quite as relevant today. So every state operates under this framework where municipalities have a broad grant of power from the state, but it's ultimately the state that holds the power, and it's just allowing localities to wield the power. But the way New Hampshire uses is very similar, particularly to other New England states, by regulating the same sorts of things: minimum lot sizes, setbacks, and generally through law enforcing the single-family zoning concept and separation of uses. If you look at a typical zoning code in any New Hampshire town, maybe the one you live in, and compare it to one in Connecticut, you probably see a lot of the same features, a lot of the same objectives, talking about a lot of the same things.
Yeah, New England is the land of large lot sizes, right? Yeah. I think Billy.
Well, and to put a point on that, and I might have to ask you for the exact number, Jason, because the number one expert on New Hampshire zoning is the guy holding the mic over there. Single-family homes are what municipalities prefer. That's what voters prefer. 93% of New Hampshire's buildable land allows single-family homes, right? So why don't we have more single-family homes? Why don't we have more affordable single-family homes? Well, the percentage of that buildable land on which a single-family home is allowed by right, meaning you don't have to go get planning board approval, on a lot smaller than an acre or 1 acre or less, is less than 10%, I believe, right?
Less than 20%.
Less than 20? Okay. I'm getting my numbers. But it's right around 15. It can be up to 18 depending on, so it's less than 20% where it's allowed by right? So you can see the problem right there. My house, so I live in Bedford. I live in a house built during the George W. administration, George Washington. And it's great. It's actually we did recite it, and it's barn board. Like, my house is really, really old, and it really was built during the Washington administration, and it was one of the original farmhouses in town. And over years, as the farmers' kids moved away and they didn't want to farm, typical New England story, they sold off the different properties. So my home in Bedford sits on a less than 1 acre lot. Now, if I wanted to build this same colonial farmhouse anywhere else in southern New Hampshire, it would probably be illegal, because you can't build on less than a 1 acre lot in most of New Hampshire. In fact, most of New England. And that's an example of why we don't have starter homes, right? So home prices are, astronomical. I don't need to go through the numbers in New Hampshire. Well, a major part of that reason is the government in your town has most likely set a 2 acre or larger lot size for any single family house. And then they tell you, well, okay, in that house, the bedrooms have to be this large, the living space has to be this large, they regulate the square footage of the house. You actually have zoning ordinances that regulate how big your balcony can be and how big, it's, some of the, people will often drive around towns like mine and go, why do you have all these developments where the houses, have these similar looks? And some of that is developers using the same architects and saving costs, and some of that is regulations that say the house has to use these materials, and it has to use this mix of materials, and it has to look this way. And so
granite curbs.
Right, yeah, granite curbs. Like, so the built world that you inhabit, wherever you live, is a creature of government. It is not a creature of free markets. It is not a creature of developers wanting to build what customers want. It is a creature of government imposing designs, imposing aesthetics, imposing size restrictions, imposing everything on the way a town looks. So we think of Manchester as the biggest city in New Hampshire being a place where it's probably, less restrictive. That's actually not true. If you just look at duplexes, not even quads or fiveplexes, two-family housing in New Hampshire is allowed on 82% of the buildable land in Berlin, New Hampshire. It is allowed on less than 25% of the buildable land in Manchester, New Hampshire. That's just a duplex. And that's by design. Over years, people in Manchester decided, we've had enough of these people living in duplexes, we're not going to allow any more duplexes. That's just one example. Manchester's building code is very inhospitable to new construction. From 1970, just to give you an example of how this affects growth, right? 50 years, from 1970 to 2020, Manchester's housing supply went up by 37%, from 36,000 units to 49,000 units. That's total, single family, everything, housing units. By comparison, over those 50 years, that sounds pretty good with 37% growth. Okay, yeah. Salem's went up by 76%. Nashua's by 80%. Derry's by 216%. The total statewide New Hampshire average is 126%. So while New Hampshire's housing units grew by 126% over 50 years, Manchester's grew by less than 40%. That was by design. Now, what's going on in Manchester right now? Manchester is, by the way, that's related to population growth. Manchester's population growth during that same time, 32%. Statewide in New Hampshire, 87%. Salem's 342%. Derry's 95%. Manchester deliberately restricted its population growth by restricting its housing growth. The result of that you can see in the news stories in Manchester over the last couple of years. Everybody here who's from Manchester knows what I'm talking about. The school system is closing multiple schools They're consolidating. They've got a redistricting plan. They're shutting down schools because there aren't enough students in the school system. The restaurants and bars and cafes and coffee shops downtown alone in the last 2 years that have closed are in the double digits because they don't have enough people in the city. And these are not brand new ones that opened. These are successful, established businesses. There aren't enough people to work those jobs. There aren't enough customers. And that's by design. The city deliberately did that to itself.
Let me take a little bit of a devil's advocate position here because we've kind of been bashing zoning for a bit. I mean, what about someone who says, you know what, if I want to move to a local town where they don't want density, right? They want spread out houses. They want rural character. What's so bad about having some places like that? Right? Shouldn't we let, especially maybe rural and suburban areas, zone out density and zone out population growth if they want to, if that's their preference? What do you guys say to that?
You guys want to take that first?
We'll start with you on the end, Josh.
So my feeling on that is that you don't have the right to control other people's property. That's their property. If you want it, you can buy it. If you want to control it, you can buy it. I think that I don't think that you have a right to your home value. I don't think that you have a right to, the town you grew up in, and, that it only had 3,000 people. I don't think that you have a right to that. I think if people want to move into it and buy that property, maybe if you buy a into a small town now, by the time you're, gray hair, it'll have grown a little bit, but not, dramatically. It's not happening like, it's not changing overnight. It's happening over years and years. And I think if you start small, even doubling or whatever is not, crazy in your lifetime. But I don't think that you have an ongoing right. It's been this way for 100 years, and I want it to be this way for another 100 years.
Charlie, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's funny you're talking about the character of a small town, and I see very often somebody who's just moved to the town where I live maybe a couple years ago, then appears at a planning and zoning meeting, even into a brand new house, and is opposing the next new house going up next door, saying, "I can't believe it! They're destroying exactly the same thing I moved here to get away from." Like, well, of course, yeah. It's like. Yes, everybody wants to, thousands of people who want to move to a town for its rural character. It's just, it's not going to work. There are ways to accommodate growth, though, I think, that can manage those goals. I think there's a middle path where you can accommodate a certain degree of growth, and I think there's a misperception as to a lot of small towns. Well, if you didn't have zoning, it would just be completely overwhelmed, which is not the case. If everywhere relaxed zoning all at once, this is a role for state reform, that demand would be more evenly distributed. And honestly, you'd probably see most of the growth focused on cities. I don't think it's unreasonable. I think certainly protecting farmland, conservation purposes, those are legitimate planning goals to preserve natural resources, but they're not incompatible. I don't think they're incompatible with property rights.
Yeah, I just want to, I love this question because we're not starting from scratch, right? So if we were starting from scratch, I think most of the people in this room would say, nothing, build what you want, wherever you want, right? We might do a little bit to say, okay, you can't build a factory right next, okay, maybe a little, maybe not. Maybe we say build whatever. But we're not starting from scratch. We've got this built world that was designed by government. So we're talking about winding that back, not starting from scratch. And so in that case, I think, practically speaking, it's okay to say, look, okay, we'll compromise on this stuff. Like, you can have, zoning is here. We're not going to get rid of it. So how do we make it make sense? How do we make it practical? How do we compromise with people who want, what they want? Well, you start to roll back things that don't make sense. And eventually you get to a place through the democratic process where you get something that works better. And, but I think conceptually, and I love that concept of, well, we have to keep things rural and stuff. My town is the best example of this. There's a group that every time we try to upzone anything in my town, they fight it, and their slogan is "Keep Bedford Rural." Most of them live in cul-de-sac developments with these following names: Bar Farms, McAfee Farms, Greenfield Farm. Every single one of their cul-de-sac developments was built on a former farm. The town used to be rural. It is no longer rural. What they're really saying is keep Bedford suburban. But that doesn't sell as well as keep Bedford rural. So they say, there's a disconnect. But again, I try to talk to people. We get pushback at the Josiah Bartlett Center from people who don't read our stuff and say, you want to abolish zoning? I'm like, just calm down, read our stuff. You can have zoning, but my argument is, I think every town ought to be able to accommodate every member of your family. So think about that for a second. Most towns are zoned for the mid-career couple with 2 kids or 3 kids. So you've got the 3,000 square foot house, you've got the cul-de-sac. That's what most zoning in southern New Hampshire is designed for. And we don't have anywhere for grandma to live. We don't have anywhere for you to live when you retire. I can't tell you how many people who've moved out of my town because there's not a condo available for them to move into after they don't need the 4,000 square foot house anymore. Their kids, and I hear this complaint all the time, go to UNH, want to move back home, but guys, you spent the last 30 years banning apartments in your town. So don't complain to me that your kid has nowhere to live. So if you can still zone it, but it's okay to say mixed use, right? Why do we have shops that most commercial zones don't allow any residential in them? The Village in Amherst, one of the loveliest places. Take a look around. There are 2 gas stations in the Village. One of them's in the Village, one is just around the corner of the gas stations. The Moulton's convenience store is directly across the street from a duplex, which is right beside the library. There's a church across. It's multi-use. And it's multifamily is allowed in this quaint little New England, downtown Portsmouth. All these colonial homes, there's also multifamily right there. There's shops and convenience stores right there. You can have that quaint New England village only if you allow a little bit of multifamily, a little bit of mixed use. That's the only way to do it. You shouldn't be afraid of that. It's okay to have some restrictions, but let's get back to look at what communities used to look like before zoning. That's what everybody claims they wish their neighborhood looked like.
Jason, if I can just add one point to that, what you said about the intent of preserving rural character. For example, in my town, which is in Connecticut, you often hear that sentiment, preserving the rural character of the town. But the entire town is zoned almost entirely for 2 and 3 acre lots, which means that every time somebody wants to put in a subdivision, you have to carve up an entire farm. And it's resulted over the last 50 years in virtually all the farmland being gobbled up for development. Yep. You can't farm on 2 or 3 acres. So not only you're not preserving the farmland, you're actually incentivizing its development until there's almost nothing left. And people look back 50 years later and they say, my goodness, what happened? How could this have happened? We were trying to preserve the rural character of the town. And it's kind of sad because you can't undo these decisions once they've been made. But it makes you think that, well, what was the underlying motivation? And just to go back to the court picture, one thing the courts have at least said is that using zoning for purposes of economic segregation, for excluding the poor, for excluding the young, excluding whoever it may be, is not a legitimate exercise of state power. That's not proper, nor is using zoning as a way to manipulate tax rates, which sometimes, Jason, you were talking about zoning for larger houses with kids, but often sometimes kids are seen as being a contributor to educational costs, and there's an attempt to exclude starter homes with young families with kids for that purpose. So, there's a whole lot of financial incentives that are involved here. So I was trying to look closely at what those incentives are.
If I could just one last real quick point on the agriculture stuff. Again, part of the pushback to the keep my town rural stuff, because what they really mean is houses with 2 or 4 acre lots. is read a book written in the 19th century. Read a book written in the 19th century that has characters living on a farm. We have this myth that they were all family farms and it was just the family living there. Who worked that farm? A lot of farms in the 19th century had multi-family housing on them. They had a place for the laborers to live. And we've outlawed that. If you really want to keep your town rural, you would allow farm workers to live in your town. But most of the zoning creates housing so expensive that no farm laborer could live in your town.
Yeah, and I think the point that you made, Charlie, about how large minimum lot sizes, they really, actually, one downside is that they do promote kind of an exurban sprawl, because you then have to, to find affordable housing, I'm going to go further and further out, definitely encourages more blacktop being spread, right? Because if you're going to divide up an entire farm, you got to build a road that all of those houses have to have frontage on it. That's usually another zoning requirement. I ran for planning board in my town last year, and that was an adventure. And yes, my main platform was, let's enforce the zoning ordinance as written. And everyone else wanted to downzone substantially, and people would say things like, this guy is for cluster development. And this was one of the things I talked about. We have a planned residential development ordinance, which allows developers to get a density bonus. They can build a little bit more houses than they otherwise would if they put like half the land under a permanent conservation easement, and they can build on smaller lots. So then you're not spreading blacktop all through the woods. And I lost. And then this year, my town got a proposal to divide up a farm, divide up a wood. It was actually a former farm that is now mostly wooded. And the developer said, I'm just going to come in. I'm going to put in the maximum number of homes I can. I'm going to carve up these lots precisely so that I can just 2 acre, 2 acre, 2 acre, 2 acre. And the planning board said, I don't know why we never get applications for planned residential developments. So anyway, this is kind of what we're dealing with. But good transition now to talk about what's has been done and what's being done. So what has New Hampshire, especially the state legislature, done so far to kind of deal with and curb some of the excesses of zoning? What are some of the policies we have now? Drew, you want to start us off there?
Well, so this is very controversial. At the Bartlett Center, we are typically we're not enthusiastic about state laws regarding zoning because we do think the local is best. There are things the state can't. There's a lot of things the state can do. The state can do whatever it wants. We're not a local control state, but we're wary of that. And one of the reasons is we want these decisions ultimately to be made at the local level, right? So if you could get the legislature to pass a law, which Josh can tell you is not easy, to sort of force upzoning, it creates massive backlash, and we saw this in Brookline, Massachusetts, recently. If you've been following those stories, so I think our general philosophical preference is that it actually happen gradually over time, even though it's going to take a long time. That most of these changes happen at the local level rather than the state level. The state's done some things like force towns to loosen their regulations on accessory dwelling units. And then they did that, and towns found a way around it, and now there's more bills to say you can't do these little loopholes and pathways that you found around it, and that's typically what happens. There's all kinds of proposals to do things like say everywhere there's single family zoning, you have to allow 4 units on that lot instead of just 1, and that's just going to provoke a predictable negative reaction. You don't want to go so far and say, you're going to have a quadruplex right beside your house, people, because again, people have invested in this. They don't kind of understand how things got the way they are, and they're afraid of these changes. So our general approach is, don't do too much at the state level yet. we'll try to push this down to the local level. And we're encouraged by some of the polling that St. Anselm Center for Ethics and Society has done, and we found that the percent, I don't have the exact numbers on me, Jason probably knows them better off the top of his head, but fewer than half, just 5 years ago, of people in New Hampshire wanted their local zoning to change, and they saw that connection between their zoning and housing prices. Now it's well over half. We're talking 60-70% of people in New Hampshire, depending on the question, are okay with not just more housing being built in their town, but they cleverly ask the question, do you want more housing built in your community? Gives you a sense, do you want it in your neighborhood?
Your neighborhood.
Your neighborhood.
We asked neighborhood, yeah.
So it's down to neighborhood in the wording of the question now, and most people are saying yes. So we're winning the battle in terms of the public, getting them to understand it. The next step is for local folks like you to go take ordinances that start to roll back this stuff. But there's lots of stuff that's going on at the state level. There's big bills, there's little bills. Josh can probably give you more of the details on those.
What about the Housing Appeals Board? Are you guys in favor of that?
Very much, yeah.
Okay.
Because the Housing Appeals Board, and just for you guys, we got a lot of pushback on this because, again, people don't read the law. And it does not allow the state to just come in and change your zoning. It just says, hey, whatever your rules are, you have to follow your rules. And, imagine that, Jason. He's just saying, just follow your rules. And so what we've had over the last several decades is planning and zoning boards not following the law because they have all the power and there was really no check above them. There's no accountability. So they would violate their own ordinances and tell developers, no, you can't build that, or we're going to extract more money from you, or we're going to delay it and delay it and delay it. And they knew that it would cost the developer so much money to fight that it wasn't worth it. The Housing Appeals Board allows these appeals to go straight to a panel instead of through court. It's much cheaper. And lo and behold, these towns have been losing these cases based on, and it's just saying follow your law. Some developers are losing too because they get stuff wrong. So it's not all one-sided, but it's been very effective. There's an effort in the legislature to do a housing court. We have family court, drug court. I think it's justified to have a separate housing court. I think we can support that. That's not here yet, and that might kill the Housing Appeals Board. But if you have a separate court that's easy to get through, and maybe you don't need the Housing Appeals Board, but by and large, it's been a good thing.
Yeah. Charlie, you seem to wince a little bit when Drew said he. I mean, what's your view on state preemption? Is it broader or about the same?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different opinion. I generally think that the state reforms that have been passed over particularly last year, but the last few years, actually have been pretty effective. The MBTA communities law in Massachusetts, right, there has been that issue with Brookline, but I believe every other town eventually did come into,
It's Milton.
Oh, Milton, thank you.
We're very happy with what we did.
Okay.
So is the state.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I still think that's right. It's like almost every town has come into compliance. Maine just passed a small multifamily reform bill last year, which came into effect at the beginning of this year, and there hasn't been, so far, a whole lot of controversy around it. Most of these reforms have been fairly modest, incremental reforms, including those in New Hampshire, like the ADU law. Yeah. And I think generally, we've seen the effect of this in terms of housing production has been mixed, but not a whole lot of public outrage about the effects of these laws. I think people, at least over the last 3 years, are looking at the housing crisis, looking at housing prices and rents, and realizing, localities have had a long time to update their zoning. These laws have been on the books for a very long time, and although some cities are changing it, the pace of change is just too slow, and the state needs to step in, take back some of that power that it gave in the 1920s. Doing so in a careful way, in a judicious way. But honestly, we've seen a ton of activity in the last year in state legislatures across the country, and even more just starting off this year. Like Arizona passed a major starter homes bill, which is awaiting signature by the governor right now. That was a bipartisan effort, I think really just reflecting the extent of the housing crisis.
Yeah, we'll see what the governor does. She's been very non-committal on that publicly. But and your Mercatus colleague Emily Hamilton has a paper on New Hampshire's ADU law, and it's definitely in the 4 digits. And the number I'm thinking of is like 2,500 maybe ADUs built just since 2017 pursuant to that law. So definitely making a dent in the issue. Josh, what's on the docket this year, and do you like what's coming down the pike? Are there the good ideas?
Yeah, so the Special Committee on Housing was formed at the State House specifically to kind of address this issue. We spent all of last year having hearings and trying to identify solutions, and we started to hear some bills, but there's a lot of interest in this issue at the state level. Last year, we, just a little history, not the current bill, but last year we passed a housing champions bill in the budget, I believe, and I'm on the rulemaking committee for that, and that is essentially one way that we are not doing a mandate. We're essentially incentivizing municipalities to do their rules. And if I have anything to say about it, and I did a little bit, to encourage them to make those bars higher, make the municipality go further and do more before they get the state money, so that we actually get some, bang for our buck. And then there's the other way that the State House is considering, and that is saying, you guys have messed this whole thing up because you guys had control, and we're going to claw a little bit of about that back. One of the things already mentioned earlier today is permitting residential units in commercial zones. That's Bill HB 1053. It's currently on its way to dying. It didn't get put towards municipal, or it didn't get put towards the housing committee. It went to my other committee, municipal and county government, and that is the death of everything that is good. And it got voted, and it's going to be voted on this Thursday. Its recommendation out of the committee is 15-2. Obviously, I'm one of those two. Mainly, the people are saying like, oh, we don't want the state to say that you should be able to have these houses in your commercial zone. We also have a bill trying to fix, those loopholes for in the ADU bill because municipalities do stuff like require four parking spots for an ADU. And so that bill is HB 1291. That bill got voted on yesterday, and it is going to have a complicated path because of some of the sponsors and what they're doing. It passed out of the committee 8-2. The housing board is going to be voted on next Thursday. 1399, which requires municipalities to permit 2 residential units in a specific single family zone, or any single family unit, essentially cutting down from the 4-plex to 2, and then a whole bunch of exemptions. That passed out of the housing committee 8-2, and that's going to be a hard floor fight. HB 1220, that is regarding driveway permits. The approval time frame, essentially, if they don't get approved in a certain amount of time, they automatically get approved. And that one got passed on consent in the House and is currently in finance. HB 1139 decreases the depth of the septic tank requirements to reduce the cost of digging the holes. That one passed on consent and is in the Senate. Currently, they haven't scheduled a hearing yet. HB 1065, retrofitting sprinklers onto existing buildings. we are saying that municipalities, so the state fire code is getting changed for 3 and 4 families, that you don't have to, when you convert, you don't have to put sprinklers in those, because sprinklers are massive, essentially kills the project, because it's too expensive. We're also put in a bill, or we just amended it and put it on consent, that municipalities also can go further than the state fire code regarding sprinklers. So that's a mandate that's actually on consent. So hopefully we will be able to get that over to the Senate, and hopefully they support that. Then we have HB 1281 regarding essentially discrimination for municipalities, saying that you have to have a certain number of you can only have a certain number of unrelated people in the home, and so that's mostly towns that are college towns, mostly, that are putting that kind of stuff in because they don't like their neighbors. And then in the Senate, there's HB 538 currently. That is the omnibus bill, and it is hasn't had a hearing yet. So that one is still kind of like, that's kind of where the landscape is as far as like the housing bills in their current status, I guess.
Yeah, the omnibus bill is kind of interesting because one of the things it's going to require if it passes, and it's in the Senate, which is usually the more establishment chamber, but towns would have to use soil-based lot sizing, so you could not have absurdly high lot sizes. They'd have to match soil and slope conditions. So that would be kind of interesting. It has a poison pill in it, which I hear the prime sponsor is going to remove, which would allow towns to have mandatory inclusionary zoning, which is a bad thing from our perspective. Yeah. It would let towns require developers to include price-controlled units as a certain percentage of units. And we don't want that. And I hear the Realtors Association complain about that as well, and the prime sponsor is going to remove that. So that'll be very interesting.
We complained about that too. So like officially, it's one of those things where and some of these are 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because you'll have something like that where you'll have, we're going to undo all these regulations, but then we're going to say towns can make developers require them to have a certain percentage of their units that they don't make a profit on. Like, well, and they know they're not just innocent about this. They know that's going to kill these big multifamily developments. That's the whole point. And they pretend that, we're doing this to help the low income people. No, you're deliberately making it so that nobody will build housing that will lower prices.
Yeah.
In some circumstances, which is not normally the case, if they get denied because of the time or whatever, I think it's I feel like in that instance, I think that I'm not sure of how much of an impact it's going to be, because the committee is just probably going to say, we're going to deny it unless you agree to this extension, essentially, and then they are going to agree to this extension.
But then they can appeal to the HAB. So I think the two might work together.
We will see.
All right, thanks everyone. We have about 15 minutes for questions, I think, so let's start it.
I wanted to bring your attention to a reform that's been put forward by the Center for Building in North America, which is the single stair floor plan for apartments. I wonder if there's any thoughts on that.
Well, we've heard it at the State House in the Special Committee on Housing. We've heard about some changes as far as being allowed to have a single staircase if you have, they have different requirements, like maybe you have to have like fire resistant hallways and stuff like that. They're shifting the cost somewhere else, but it can make it more feasible in some buildings, I believe. So
yeah, it definitely helps with floor plans, and if you're tight for space, apparently single stairs.
And the biggest concern, the biggest objection to that is fire, right? And but if you look at the news stories that happen almost every week in New Hampshire about a fire in a building, it's almost always a single family stick-built home from the past. It's an older single-family stick-built home. The new materials that they're using to build buildings now are so much better, and so it's definitely an idea that's worth exploring for sure, for more flexibility.
And it really is catching on. Just in the last few months, this idea is being circulated in state houses across the country, and I think widely being disseminated through fire departments. In the past, it's only been really legal in New York and Seattle, and for decades they haven't had any issues as long as you're building up to modern codes.
That's it.
You do see objections, but for example, in a hotel like this or other ones you may have been to, you see a 200-foot long corridor where you may be very far away from one of the two staircases. Whereas in a narrow apartment building, you might have one staircase, but you open the door to your apartment, it's right there. It's like, would you rather have to run down a long hallway? There's a lot more that goes into it rather than just the number of access points, like how quickly you can get out of the building. And I think fire departments are starting to realize that, and it's good that there are examples of American cities that have done this. And it does make a big difference in terms of not just safety, but floor plans. If you have a hallway running through the building, everybody's facing the hallway, right? You just have, like a hotel, you have one window facing out. If you have one staircase in the middle, you can get light and air on 2-3 sides, which makes a big difference for apartment living.
Over here.
You all were talking earlier about kind of the dismal state of the takings clause and the court's kind of refusal to recognize when you take 19 out of $20 away that it's not happening. I'm wondering if you're seeing any glimmers of hope in recent years that the corner may be turning on that. I've been following the work of a couple of libertarian law firms, the Institute for Justice, the Civic Legal Foundation, and they seem, I don't know if there's been any major cases yet, but they seem kind of optimistic that the Supreme Court can make some major favorable changes.
Yes, actually, the PLF just argued a case at the Supreme Court back on early January, it's a takings case from out in California, the Sheets case, which is not exactly not quite a regulatory takings case, but it's about an exaction fee. It's a fee that a home builder out in California was being asked to pay $50,000 as a road improvement fee on the other side of the county. And he was objecting to that and said, that has absolutely nothing to do with me building my modest house. This is some huge county. It's like the size of Rhode Island on a road he would never use. So, yeah, PLF was actually the lead on that case, and they should be issuing a decision on that. And I think they're intending to explore that further in other contexts. If anybody's interested in that, just check out PLF's website or IJ. They have a sort of vigorous property rights agenda. But that case, look out for a decision before.
We'd love to see them act on rent control. But
Oh,
yeah. Unfortunately, that did. But I will say, there are other tests available. It's something I've been working on as well. It's not just takings. There's due process issues around zoning.
I mean, if you look at the 20th century and in that early part of the 20th century when the zoning laws were getting written, the U.S. suffers from horrifically bad zoning laws and zoning ordinances, but also horrifically bad court cases. Just astonishing legal precedents that came in that progressive era that a lot of current scholars are looking back scratching their heads on how any of that makes any sense in continuity with the Constitution as the framers intended it. It's really remarkable. On just property rights in general, just thinking about takings and stuff, it just sort of, again, this is a conceptual thing, but I think everybody here is probably pretty in favor of property rights. But if you think about property rights, and I kind of push back on the people who don't want to do away with zoning, even on the fringes, like even on the margins, don't want to change things. I want to get you to think about how much right do you have to control your property when it comes to the built portion of your property versus how much of a right you have to control your neighbor's property, right? So, seriously. So if you want to change your staircase, if you want to change your doors, the entryways to your house, if you want to change the appearance of your house, if you want to build it slightly closer to a million things that are regulated about your house that literally you are forbidden by law from doing. Like you have to go get ask, please, Mother, may I, to the board, to the local board, to get permission to make small changes, some places even the color of your house, right? So that's just a massive constraint on your property rights. You can't have, friends crash in your house for over a certain period of time, that becomes illegal because they're unrelated people living. It's just, you have so little control over your lived space in terms of what you're allowed to do to it. But if you want to tell your neighbor what to do with his space, New Hampshire, all you got to do is put a warrant article on. You get 25 people in your town, 60 people, depending on what, and you can, and it'll probably pass. And so you probably have a better chance of telling your neighbors what they can do with their houses and their land than you do of controlling what you can do with your own house and your own property. And that's just a crazy way to think about it, but that's actually the way it works.
This is just a matter of perspective on what we mean when we talk about property rights, right? Because you say, well, we don't want the state coming in to take away local control. But the other way of looking at it, the way some people might look at it, well, it's not the state taking away local control, it's the state restoring individual liberty that had been taken away in the first place. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's right. It's a complicated notion, but that's, I think, one way to look at it too, as though you're establishing a certain set of underlying rights that each individual owner has, at least a baseline.
Tom.
I'm a big fan of Charles Marone, Strong Towns. It's really kind of my first introduction to the concepts. His talking about the shall issue building permits and the concept of value per acre to explain why the natural towns that we love, taper out from extreme high value and they taper out to the dregs. Whereas I live in Claremont, we put the dregs downtown and we put it all, and then we try and connect it with $1 billion worth of infrastructure that no one can afford to pay for. So the road, in an effort to create this artificial reality, we've created an infrastructure system that bankrupts the town, including the rich people. Everyone just, the whole thing goes to hell. Is there any concept of, this taper of wealth, from the center to the perimeter that expresses the cost of those water lines, sewer lines, roads? I know how to do that inside a natural economic order, but can that even be done in zoning? Is there any way to express my desire to come with this law, or am I just
I'm going to say not.
Makes sense? You don't try to drop that. I don't
the thing
can't
is,
phrase it well.
The thing is, the original zoning, the Zoning Enabling Act, was not drafted by a planner. It was drafted by a lawyer from New York, who was very concerned about all the procedures, but not so much concerned about the dollars and cents and the issues that towns deal with, infrastructure issues, right? Linear feet of sewer lines and water lines, and it's just not a good tool for dealing with that. I think that's more an issue of municipal planning.
Because we're actually taking a poke at it. I sat through a horrible planning board commission in Claremont a week ago, and we got someone in the rural area who wants to do an experiment. He's put 16 houses on an acre, 1,000 square feet of pop. And I don't know how they're going to work the septic because it doesn't connect to the city.
Boy.
They're out in the woods, and I hope it works. But it's the first step. Something's better than nothing.
Well,
how does that fit DES guidelines? I would wonder, because wouldn't the state have something to say about density that high? Okay.
I bumped into this.
They have a community. They could have a community well.
Oh, okay, like a big community septic on a.
That's what I was expecting.
Yeah.
Because I was actually expecting him to say something like, "Well, we can only do composting toilets." Right? Because there's not, or you're going to have to create some utility around this isolated. They're barely connected.
Did you say 16?
16.
I'm pretty sure. Isn't there? I think there's a threshold where if you go over a certain number of connections, then you have like way more regulatory burden, and I think it may be around that number. And there, so that may.
They're one under whatever they're
Exactly.
They're coming up for second review.
Yeah.
All right, we've got time for one more. Renita.
Do you have any suggestions for getting an exemption for land survey when subdividing?
Exemptions for the requirement to do a survey?
That sounds like a highly personal question.
Yeah.
Go to a town with no zoning.
I think no. I mean, honestly, I think the survey is required for the legit reason that You got to know that where the line
owns
is,
what?
right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, again, for a personal example, somebody didn't really well survey my property, and the town came out and did it last year, and my yard is actually smaller than I was mowing, so yeah, which I just found out. So there's real reasons.
Is there a difference between the board though and then having to survey like all the land?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but I don't think you're going to get rid of surveying requirements. Yeah.
Well, is there a significant, oftentimes there's like a significant fee that's attached to it, which is another issue in terms of that's way beyond the work that's being done, right? Is that
Well, I
also
was
considered?
told by the planner that you can request an exemption. I have to go read through the regulations. I don't know how easy that is to do, but then every town has different
Probably a
regulations.
resurvey.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, maybe it's already been surveyed, and that would. Oh, it hasn't.
Talked to the
No.
owner who was the original owner, and he said
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're probably going to have to do it.
Yeah, procedural complexity, not even being able to figure out, you try to read a 300-page zoning code and the procedures, and you can't even figure out how to qualify, right? It's like you need to retain an attorney just to figure out what your rights are as a landowner, which is another, or hire a surveyor, which costs a lot of money. So
Yeah.
that's another
Well,
area for
if I
reform.
hired a surveyor just to get the exemption at least, I don't know if they would do that for.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
All right, thank you.